What's up, guys? This is Mr. Holder here. I am going to talk to you about something entirely new this time. It's out of the Blue Book. It's actually the largest section in the Blue Book. It's dedicated to typography, so that go figure. You wouldn't think that that's so important, but it really is in graphic design. It's just dealing with text and type, um, and the reason it's so big, this video is going to be kind of a little bit lengthy, but I'll try to condense this down. I've trimmed a lot of the fat out of it, what it talks about in that particular chapter. But it's incredibly important, especially if you're going to be taking my class next year, that we talk about typography and some of the considerations that you need to think about when you're talking about text and using fonts and that type of thing. So we're going to cover four major areas. Within this chapter on typography, and they are type terms, font categories, careful considerations, and type don'ts. So things that you want to actually not do with your text at all costs, because it'll just make your designs look terrible. Anyways, I'm doing well. I hope you guys are doing awesome too. I'm coming in very casually. I got my hat on today and my glasses or whatever, and I'm totally relaxed. Already finished my second cup of coffee and whatnot. So, anyways, so hopefully you guys are all doing okay and whatnot. So, hopefully you're figuring out these little side projects and distance learning and whatnot. So this week and into next week, we're going to be doing typography, and so. This will take you a little bit more time. Like I said, it'll carry you into next week. And there's two different small assignments you have to do. Both are really easy to do. Just do the best you can when you do them. But without further ado, let's talk about text. Like I said on Haiku, the one thing about text and typography, it's oftentimes the last consideration that's done on most designs. I've been guilty of this in the past. I'll come up with a design that I'm excited about. I know what I'm going to do in terms of the layout. I will figure out what pictures I want to put in, what illustrations, what vector graphics, what have you. Apply all my effects. And the last thing that I think about is the typography. And that's really bad. Text should be just as important as any other thing that you put into your design and be really carefully considered for so many reasons. It's basically an art form, and a lot of times too, and I've been guilty of this. You'll type out your text, and then you'll just kind of leave it as is. You don't even adjust the spacing between letters. You don't manipulate some of the letter forms, especially on titles, especially when it comes to logos and things like that. And that's really, really bad, especially on logos and brands. Oftentimes, your logo and brand is going to have text, and you apply your font and you call it a day and you leave. But you need to go in and maybe move letters around, warp letters, do things differently than just what comes with the actual font, and that'll make your designs look that much better. So rarely is a font good to go as soon as it leaves your brain and goes on the piece of paper. So remember that. So the first thing we're going to talk about is type terms. And the four terms we're going to be talking about is, what is a font? What's a font family? What's a font style? And what's a font category? And you've probably heard the term font before. I'm not going to get into the history of where that term comes from. But what is a font exactly? So here I am in Illustrator, and I'm going to open up the character palette, which is, of course, going to be super important when we're talking about dealing with typography. The character palette's really important. And the character palette in Illustrator, you have a character tab, a paragraph tab, and this open type one, which I've never used. But I'll probably be toggling back and forth between character and paragraph as I take you through this. So what a font is basically is it's a style of letter form. It's also called letter form or type form that you're going to use in whatever it is you're creating. That could be a design. It could even be a paper you're writing for English class. And you know that the fonts are located in your font list of whatever you've installed on your computer. So you can install a ton of fonts. When you buy a computer, it comes with fonts already installed. At any rate, you can go in and choose different types of fonts. And you can see I have a whole ton of fonts here. Most graphic designers will have thousands installed on their computer. And you usually need some sort of a font Bible or a way to manage those fonts. Again, I'm not going to get into that. But you can turn fonts on and off, etc., with software like Adobe. But as we're looking at this, I have a whole big list of fonts, and they come in all different types of styles. But a font is basically what we call like a type form or a letter form. And usually within the font comes a font family. And with the font family, there are styles. And so a font family would be like if you're talking about a font called Bodoni, for example. And I think that comes, yeah. So I have Bodoni on this called Bodoni MT. And if I open this up, you can see this particular Bodoni that I have installed on my computer has a whole bunch of different font styles. And all of these font styles make up the font family or family of fonts. And some font families only have one style, regular. And it only comes one way. You can't really do anything with it. But Bodoni, for example, if I click on my word font here and I apply Bodoni to it, you can see it change. And if I click this little drop down, I have a whole bunch of different styles of Bodoni within this font family that I could choose from: italic, bold, etc. And you probably never knew this before, but we call this the font family. And within that family are different styles, just like there's different characteristics of people within your family. They might have different color hair, they might have different tastes in food and that type of thing. The same goes with this font family. So I wanted you guys to be aware of that when you're kind of dealing with this, so you know where it comes from. And you'll see certain characteristics of Bodoni, and you can get it in a fatter version of it, and you can get it in a tighter or condensed version of it, et cetera. And so you kind of have to experiment with what you like in terms of, and what's appropriate to your client and whatever you're doing for your design. So that's the font family, the font style. And now let's talk about the font category. So your categories of font are going to be listed usually in about 5 different varieties. And here we're working with Bodoni. So I'm going to change this entirely to Bodoni. There we go. And what a font category is whether or not it's sans serif, serif, novelty, script, ornament, monospace. There's a bunch of different font categories out there, but I want to talk to you about 5 specific ones, and that is serif, sans serif, script, novelty, and ornament. Those are the general categories that you can find in most fonts, and you need to be aware of it. It's super important. And that is, what's the difference between these? So a serif tends to look more old school. And what I'll do for you is change this to an actual serif typeface. So serifs are the little tiny decorative ends on fonts. So this is going to look more old school, like something like Times New Roman, for example. So I'm going to go down here to Times New Roman because it's something that you're all very familiar with. Okay. And it's what you type your papers in. Usually your English teachers are like, okay, type it Times New Roman. And I'm going to zoom in real close for you so we could take a look at these letter forms a little bit closer. So on something like a Times New Roman or a serif typeface, in the old school days of typesetting, this is hundreds of years ago, it had these little decorative ends on them called serifs. Okay, so you can see it on this S quite, it stands out. And then on this R and on this I, etc., these little decorative ends that kind of stick out. And there's all different types of styles out there of serif typeface, and they tend to just look more old school versus something called sans serif. In sans serif, it's basically more modern. And in the 20th century, different typographers said, you know what, we're going to cut off these little decorative ends, and we're just going to leave it looking more modern and cleaner, and spacing will look nicer, etc. And this kind of came about in the industrial age. So if you compare this R in the serif typeface of Times New Roman to this R, you can see these little decorative ends have been cut off. So you just need to be aware that one looks more old school and one looks a little bit more modern. Okay, and so there's all different types of fonts that are sans serif typeface or more modern. And so the one that I have actually applied to this is called Myriad Pro, which is the default font that comes with Adobe software. The next one would be script. So let's change this over to a script typeface, or a script font. There we go. And this one tends to, you guessed it, look a little bit more handwritten. There we go. And what you'll notice about script fonts is each letter form, just like in handwriting, will carry over and connect itself to the next letter form. So it actually looks like it's written in handwriting. And what's nice about this is it tends to add a little bit more of a thematic sense to it. It looks handwritten, it looks fancy, and it just has a different style to it. But it's totally different from serif and sans serif in its own way and its own characteristics. The fourth one's going to be novelty. Novelty is fantastic for enhancing the theme of your design. You'll see more novelty looking fonts and logo designs and brands because a lot of designers will do it custom. You'll also see novelty fonts in things like titles and subtitles, but rarely is novelty font actually, or novelty style font used for larger bodies of text. And so I'll get to more of that in a second here, but I just wanted to kind of show you what that means. So here's what I would consider a novelty font. Okay, so here's one that looks sort of like something that would have been written in like 1940s Germany, for example. It's very Celtic looking and sort of almost like something that would be from the Middle Ages even. And you'll see little things added to them, like little I would say special effects like this distressed look, like these words are cracking, etc. And again, it adds to the theme of what it is that you're trying to do. So just know about this one, the novelty fonts are great for thematic purpose. A really good website that I often tell my students to go to is 1001 Fonts because these fonts are free to use and they carry with it a lot of character. And again, it's good for things like if you're trying to do I would say larger size one line or single word text to text, like for titles and subtitles especially. But you wouldn't use like puppy love brush, for example, in a large paragraph and expect your people to like be able to like read a large paragraph in this particular style. It would drive them crazy. But in terms of a title that might lead into it, maybe you're selling in an advertisement and you're using this font for well, because it says puppy, let's just say it's for a dog washing service. And you want your customers to be able to see this as a title to kind of lead them in and draw them in. But then you write your larger paragraph or your little selling points in like a sans serif or a modern typeface that kind of goes along with it. But it's easier to read because the one thing about novelty fonts is they don't usually look good when they're in greater amounts in a lot of words, and because the spacing might be weird or whatever, or that type of thing. So I would say anything that you're going to see on websites like that, 1001 Fonts, are going to be considered novelty style fonts. And then last but not least would be ornament. Ornaments would be like dingbats, things that you would use for small symbols like bullet points. And it's its own category. Each of these are its own category because they're so different from one another. But ornaments would be like dingbats. So if you go to your computer, all computers are installed with them. So we're looking for like wingbats or wingdings, etc. And when you click that, you're going to see all the letter forms turn into just little symbols, like little zodiac symbols. Here's like a little diskette, a snowflake, etc. And each of the letters on your keyboard correspond to a different symbol within this. Again, these, what purpose these serve kind of in graphic design would be really for like bullet points or maybe for making small, tiny lines, thematic lines, but never for icons on things like brands or logo designs. I wouldn't ever do that. That's really bad. So let's talk a little bit more about what these do for your designs. Serif typefaces scientifically have been proven to be easy to read in larger bodies of text. That's why your books, when you're reading books or you're reading, novels and that type of thing, most oftentimes they're actually printed in a serif old school typeface because it's easy on the eyes. Sans serif, on the other hand, could be a little bit more modern looking for an audience, can be written in larger bodies of text like paragraphs and even books, but is not as easy to read as a serif typeface. Things for script, novelty, that type of thing, like I said, it's more or less for thematic purposes. You might use script in a wedding invitation, which might have several lines of text, but not necessarily look good in small typed paragraphs. That's a small amount of points that, of course, and I think this goes without saying, you guys probably know this, that when you guys type out your words, the sizing is listed in points. And you guys know 12 point, probably the most famous one that you guys know, because most of your papers are typed in 12-point font, and it's about this big. It's super small. And then, of course, the larger that you get would be good for things like titles, etc. So I'm just going to leave that as 12-point. So that's the different font categories. Really important stuff. I want you guys to know what those are, especially if you're going to be taking year 2 with me. So you know how to handle your type and what they're good for and what they're not good for. So again, serif, typeface is good for larger bodies of text, sans serif. Also for larger body of text, but not as easy to read as serif. Know the difference between those two. One has the little decorative ends on it, one doesn't. One looks more modern, one looks more old school. Script looks like it's handwritten. Novelty fonts have a thematic purpose to them, are good for titles, etc., etc. And then ornaments or wingdings or webdings or whatever you want to call it are good for things like bullet points or maybe lines of like dividing lines. You might make it with these little hieroglyphs or whatever, but not for major purposes, more of a supporting element type of thing. Okay, so let's look at the third area I want to talk to you about in this video is, there it is, careful considerations for your text. And under careful considerations, this is just when you're using text, what should be the things you're thinking about when you're using your text? First and foremost is your theme. So you're going to sit down, you're going to design something. It could be a logo, it could be advertisement or whatever. So you're going to have like an overall theme, an overall audience that you're going to try to sell to, etc. And so you want to pick your fonts and choices of text based on that theme. Who's your audience? You might consider using bigger letters if it's like for an older crowd of people that have a harder time seeing with their eyes, or not going really microscopic on your text. If you can't, if you're squinting at your text and you can't tell what it says from a distance, then you might want to consider, thematically speaking, a font that's more readable at a smaller size, that type of thing. So theme is super important. The next one is legibility and readability. We got to consider this because if your audience can't read what you're actually trying to say to them, that can be a bad thing. And again, audience matters on this. When you look at things like gig posters, when you're trying to sell like some sort of a concert or something to a certain crowd of people, and that was the important thing about gig posters back in the day in the 60s. It was kind of cool because the younger crowd was like, hey, we want something edgy and we don't want the older, like crusty people to be able to figure out what we're going to be doing at this particular music gig or whatever. So they liked the obscurity of the way text look and sort of the hidden messages there that only their audience would actually get. And the older crowd in the group wouldn't be able to figure out. But in most cases, you want your text to be legible and readable. So what I tell my students is, if you stand back and you look at your design, you shouldn't just look at it at one distance the whole time from your computer. You need to like get back from, at a distance and take a look at it. So, can I read this title? Of course, if it's larger bodies of text like paragraphs, that's okay for it to be smaller in like a 12-point font, because it's the other stuff in your design that's going to bring your viewers into the design first and allow them to decide on their own whether or not they want to look at the more like finite specific parts of your design. The next one would be alignment and spacing. And this one I kind of wanted to actually type out for you. Is alignment being, is it going to be left aligned? How much spacing is going to be between your different sentences and actual words? And you have control over that in the different programs like Illustrator and Photoshop. So if I highlight a bit of text, I can increase or decrease how much I want my spacing to be. So if you look at kerning, for example, that's the space between two letters, but the space between all the words that you have selected would be considered what's called leading, or a lot of people call it leading on accident. But you can see here is I have that selected in my character palette. If I go on to a negative amount, the words kind of start to smush together. Or I could go the other way and actually spread the words out. So you got to be careful when you do this. Usually your font, what it comes with, already has a setting that's pretty good, and 0 usually is a good setting to start with. But you might want to fill space by actually increasing the spacing between letters or lines of text, etc. Just want you to be aware that that stuff is actually there and can be edited. So I'll leave that at 0. Or I could highlight all these lines of text and go over here to what's called the leading, and that's the space between the lines, and choose a very open-ended spacing, or really bring it back. And you probably never knew it as leading, because in your English classes they just, it's double space, single space. But we call it leading, and you're going to think it says leading, but if I put this at 7 point, you can see this stuff starts to smush together. And maybe that's relevant to what your design is and what your idea is for your design. But in most cases, if you want something to be readable, you're not going to smush everything together. Again, I just want you to be aware that that's something that can be edited and considered when you're choosing. So the space between the letters, which is called tracking or kerning, and the space between the lines is called leading. All right, so I'm just going to leave that alone at 12 point, call it a day on that, and sort of move on. The last area for careful consideration is what you should do with things like your title, your subtitle, and your paragraph. What font should you use? And like I said, novelty fonts, you got to be careful. You don't want to write a paragraph of text with a font that looks like this. Let's just go with something like this. I mean, can you imagine reading this in a textbook, for example, and you have to read several paragraphs with this all caps? Your brain's going to hurt after a while and literally cause you to have headaches. So you got to be careful when you're choosing titles and subtitles. If it's just one or two words and it's going to be a title, then this type of typeface will be okay. But if it's a paragraph, go with something that's a little bit easier on the eyes, like maybe Minion, for example. You could read this because it's a serif typeface. We know that serifs are easier to read in larger bodies of text. You could read this smaller. It's going to be easier on the eyes. And this is for anybody that's human. It doesn't matter if you're old or young, etc. But just some things to consider there. Know what to use for your titles and subtitles versus your paragraph. And then the last area I want to look at before I close out this video is what to never ever do with your typography. These are typographic don'ts, and these are covered in the DBI Blue Book as well. And let's just look at these real quick with each other. And that is orphans. Orphans, orphans is like little kids that parents either passed away or left them, and they're all by themselves, and somebody else adopts them and they become an orphan, right? Well, you could do this with your text as well. Here's what an orphan looks like. An orphan can be done either with hyphenation and correct hyphenation. So here I have a block of text inside of a text box, and if I squish this down, oh, no, I don't have a block of text here. Better yet, I'm going to highlight this, and I'm going to put it in a text box. I'm going to draw out a text box. There we go. Well, I'll just show you with this filler text here. And so within this text box, as I squish this down, it's going to hyphenate stuff. So you have to be careful of not letting whatever program you're using actually create orphans this way. And so here's what an orphan actually looks like. For whatever reason, you get one little teeny tiny word all by itself at the bottom. That aesthetically speaking doesn't look good. And this can also, I just wanted you to know, it could also happen with hyphenating too. So just be aware of your hyphenation. You have control over this. You can actually put little hard carriage returns after these types of things to bring things in line. Like I could bring this NISL. If I click my little cursor in front of that and I hold shift and hit return, it will put that together at the bottom and actually push the next one down. So that way you could bring this one back up, the backspace there, so that it's not by itself, okay? Because then it starts to look sort of top heavy. And it's funny because this is doing like filler text. But let me get a better example for you. Let's say I type out, do not leave words as orphans, okay? And you get this for whatever reason. Orphans all by itself. So what we want to do instead is think about bringing that word as to the next line. And it's a subtle difference. You may never have thought of this, but it just looks more aesthetically pleasing, especially if it can fit into your design and it doesn't screw anything else up in your design. Make sure you do this. Don't leave words by themselves. The next one would be, you don't want anything like this, where if you had this in a text box and suddenly orphans looked like a weird hyphenated version of it. So now somebody reads this and they're like, do not leave words as orp, hands. That doesn't make any sense, right? And so sometimes you'll get weird stuff like this when you allow the program to do the hyphenation for you. So be super careful. The next one also is be careful of having your text be top heavy. So what tends to look bad about this is not only do we have an orphan, but this sort of top portion of the sentence is jutting out over everything else, and it looks like it's going to start to like tumble over to the right. So one way to fix that is maybe take words as orphans on the next line, bring orphans back up, and suddenly it's balanced out and it looks like it's more grounded and it's not as top heavy. Again, if that fits with your design. So that's what orphan means on this. Avoid at all costs doing all caps with script. So if we said do not do script in all caps, okay? And then you put a script on this. This always looks bad. And I can't tell you how many times you'll start to notice, and you can't even read it, but you'll see this a lot in even more professional areas on signs and things like that, where I don't know who did the design, but it just looks absolutely terrible. And it doesn't matter what the script is that you try to do, it's just going to look terrible when you do it. Just avoid it at all costs. If it's a script font, do it upper lowercase. Do not do script in all caps. You can read it, it looks like it's supposed to because it's supposed to look handwritten. Number 3, stacking. Avoid this at all costs too. Stacking letters. This would be like, let's get a font here. We'll put don't. Oops. Do it in all caps. Don't stack. Okay. And then I'll bring in like a serif typeface that you can read. No, this is okay. I'll just use the sans serif. This would be like stacking the letters like this by putting hard carriage returns down the side. It just doesn't look good. And what happens is these don't line up usually in a straight line when you do this. So I just avoid doing it. If I want to do vertical text, on the other hand, what you could always do is type it out like regular and then turn it on its side. So instead, take your text and just use a little bit of rotate and put it on its side. If you got to do vertical text. But in most cases, you're not going to stack. The next one is combining font families of the same category. This is a real subtle one, but it looks bad to do this. And that is, let's say you have a serif typeface, okay, as a title, and then smaller underneath it, especially for things like logos, etc. You change this down to like 8 typeface. You add in a different serif typeface. It's so funny because I actually just changed that to 8 and just decided, no, we're going to say 12. There, okay. So we got, and then we're going to change this to a different serif typeface. So let's try, what's this in here? Okay, Baskerville. It almost looks the same. Let's try one that's a little bit different here. Okay, Centaur almost looks the same. What you want to do instead is actually pick a very different category of typeface. So if I got a serif typeface, then I want to change this to maybe a script typeface instead underneath it. So if you got like a title and then a subtitle, maybe you go with something like this underneath it, and then you set the width to be, or the size to be as big, because it comes in a little bit smaller. We're going to increase the spacing on that. It'll actually look better to have both of these near each other than it would be to have them be within the same type category, actually. And then I'm going to set this to be We'll go center justified on that. It just looks more exciting. And the last but not least is stair stepping of any type. Just avoid this at all costs too. It's like you've heard people say don't use Comic Sans, right? Avoid Comic Sans. Avoid stair stepping. So we're going to go to the next line and then put some spaces. This type of thing. This just looks so amateurish and terrible. All right, so avoid that too. So that's it in terms of typography and the things that I want to talk to you about. Make sure you double check the instructions that you guys are going to be doing for the assignment this week. Check it carefully. There's two parts to it. The first one is going to be doing a little scavenger hunt where you're getting examples of the different font categories like serif, sans serif, etc. You're getting like 5 examples of serif, and typing that out in a PowerPoint presentation. And the second part, and that first part's easy, but the second part takes a little bit more creativity, and that's within PowerPoint creating a little typographic postcard where you're going to showcase one particular font of your choice, get information on that font. There's a history behind those. It's actually quite interesting. Have fun with it. Stay safe, and